We're about 3 months away now from the opening ceremonies of the Paris Olympic Games, 89 days to be exact. And of course, you'll be able to watch all of it right here on NBC 10 Boston and our sister stations.
Hey, did you know, or do you remember that Boston had a shot at actually hosting these 2024 Summer Olympics? And for a few months, a magical few months, it looked like it just might happen.
I do remember that. Back in 2014, prominent civic and business leaders worked on a privately funded bid for the Games, including then Mayor Marty Walsh, who was in his first year in office. Then in January 2015, a surprise win. The U.S. Olympic Committee backed Boston as the host city over Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Washington.
And polls at the time showed a slight majority of Bostonians supported the bid, but it didn't take long for questions and concerns about the costs associated with hosting the Games surfaced.
In February the next month, Massachusetts, of course, slammed by Snowmageddon. Who can forget that? A record-smashing 110 inches of snow hit the city, and the MBTA did not handle it very well. And its poor performance led to debate about the wisdom of using state funds on any additional potential overruns tied to the Games instead of fixing the T.
And at the same time, concerns grew about the lack of transparency around Boston's successful bid to the USOC, and those concerns grew. Did the city agree to pay all the cost overruns? And opponents, including the grassroots group No Boston Olympics, questioned the wisdom of hosting, pointing out that the cities that hosted Olympics found the economic benefits didn't outweigh the costs associated with them. It was clear by March that public sentiment about the Games was shifting. A Mass Inc. poll showed that 51% of those polled in January supported the plan. That support had dwindled to 36% in March and remained below 40%.
In June, a revised Olympic bid 2.0 was then released, aimed at addressing the concerns, but by July, 6 months after winning, the big Olympic dream had died.
I refuse to mortgage the future of the city away. I refuse to put Boston on the hook for overruns. And I refuse to commit to signing a guarantee that uses taxpayers' dollars to pay for the Olympics.
So Mayor Walsh said at the time he wouldn't be rushed into signing a host city contract without more assurances that taxpayers won't be held responsible for potential cost overruns. Now, later that day, Boston 2024 organizers and the USOC jointly pulled the plug on Boston's bid. Remember all of that?
I do indeed. It's all coming back.
Just like it was yesterday. It's hard to imagine what Boston would be like today if we were still planning for the Games. And I want to take a bit of a look back at the whole process and what could have been for the city had the bid been successful. So joining us now are Chris Dempsey, who is one of the public faces of No Boston Olympics. You saw him in the video there. Chris is now a partner at the design firm Spec Dempsey, and Shirley Leung, business columnist and associate editor at the Boston Globe. Shirley covered the Olympics bid closely at the time. She has also hosted the Globe opinion podcast, Say More. Shirley, I kind of want to start with a broad question here as we talk about the Olympics. I can't believe it's been 10 years since this bid was announced. Are we better off not having had the Olympic Games here?
I don't think anyone regrets not having the Olympics, but I was one of the few that kept an open mind. And let's just say, what did we want? I think Boston works best on a deadline. And what did we want to get out of hosting the Olympics? We wanted to fix the T. We wanted more middle-class housing. We wanted a renovated White Stadium. We wanted Whiteette Circle to be the newest neighborhood of Boston. And none of that is happening. In fact, the T has gotten worse. The housing crisis has gotten worse. Whiteette Circle, which is this industrial yard, is now going to be a staging area for the MBTA for extra rail cars. So none of that is happening right now. So it's part of me, a little regret on my part. Too bad we didn't have a deadline to keep Boston on track.
So, Chris, that was sort of my question to you that Shirley just talked about. You were opposed to the Olympics. I don't think you've changed your mind on it.
Absolutely
Obviously,
not.
You had issues with the process, the transparency, which we're going to talk to about that in just a bit. But some in your group said that we should be using our capital, both our money and our brain, to address issues like inner city violence, healthcare costs, housing. And 10 years later, we don't have the Olympics, and we still have those problems. So did we make the right decision? And why didn't everyone shift to fixing those problems after stopping the Olympics?
Well, the few Boston 2024 supporters who are left would tell you that if the Games had come here, that we'd be all eating ice cream and flying unicorns to work every day, and everything would just be perfect. The reality of city after city that host the Olympics is that they focus on a 3-week event. They build stadiums and venues that they don't have a use for after the games. Then the games leave town and they're left with a multi-billion-dollar hangover. The main takeaway from the Boston 2024 experience should be that the people of Massachusetts are a pretty savvy bunch. And when they're presented with the pros and cons and they're told that their tax dollars are on the line and they're responsible for 100% of the cost overruns for an Olympic Games, that they say thanks but no thanks, and they were smart to do so.
But do you think it would have forced city leaders, state leaders to do some of the things that we're not doing right now, like fixing the T, like maybe putting some infrastructure in place in spots that really need it at this point? Would it have kind of forced the city and the state to do those things?
I mean, I think it would have, right, Chris? I mean, it would have. At the very least, we could have fixed the T.
Right.
I'd like to think so, as someone that regularly rides the T. Unlike most of the elite supporters of Boston 2024, let's use an example that Shirley already brought up with Whitehead Circle. Whitehead Circle is an industrial area that the MBTA has now invested in so that they can have rail cars, okay? That's not as sexy as an Olympic stadium. I get that. No one's going to tune into NBC Boston this summer to watch rail cars versus watching the Olympics. But space for rail cars is an absolutely essential part of making a transit system work better. We are able to do that and put our citizens and our T-riders first because we're not focused on a stadium being built on that site that, remember, was going to be built for the cost of hundreds of millions of dollars, used for 3 weeks, and then torn down afterwards.
Shirley, we were talking before the show, the three of us, about how it was so naive, our conversations back then. It was pre-COVID. All these things hadn't happened. Like, we have no idea, no crystal ball. If we had said yes to the Olympics or no to the Olympics, where we would be. Let's just, we need to be clear about that. But at the same time, we're looking at this crisis in Boston regarding empty office buildings and low tax revenue, and the housing crisis still continues to get worse. Do you still maintain that there is a part of this, hosting the Olympics, that would have helped those issues and diminished them? I mean, what would have happened to Blue Hill Avenue? What would have happened to Franklin Park? Would White Stadium be a done issue by now? Do you really think that there was some positives there that we didn't get to really mine?
I mean, there was certainly lost opportunity. I mean, again, I want to go back to Boston would have worked better on a deadline, you know, and, now we would have seen Blue Hill Avenue in parts of Dorchester, parts of Mattapan. It would have blossomed by now. Now, it's not to say that that would never happen. It's instead of in 10 years, it might take 20, 30 years, 40 years. Certainly something like Whitehead Circle, it might take half a century now to see that as a new neighborhood of Boston. Because after the T is done with, using Whitehead Circle as a rail yard, at some point, it can be resold and redeveloped, but it might take 50 years.
Chris, some cities weren't devastated. I mean, London, still standing. Paris is probably
LA is fine.
LA, still standing. I mean, if you look at the mass data of host cities, Greece was in turmoil before they hosted the Olympics. What is that still the take, that we would have been left in worse shape?
So London had billions and billions of dollars of cost overruns. And there's a major difference between hosting the games in London and in Boston. In the UK, the national government provides the financial guarantee. So if you have billions of dollars of cost overruns, they can be spread over all of the taxpayers across the United Kingdom. That doesn't exist in the United States. So when we make the guarantee, it's really taxpayers in Boston and Massachusetts. That's about 7 million people versus the 70 million people that live in the UK. It's 10 times as much of an impact. Let me get to one other point here. The Boston 2024 boosters talk about all these things that would have happened, all the benefits that would have come to the city. And you say, well, okay, can we really trust those statements? And I'm not saying Shirley, but the other supporters out there, right? Those were the very same folks that were using statistics like no Olympic Games in the US has ever had a cost overrun. And a simple Google search of Lake Placid Olympic cost overruns. Put that into Google right now, and what comes up is a New York Times article talking about the cost overruns. So they lost the trust of the public when they went out there and they made statements that were untrue and then tried to come back and make all sorts of promises about how our lives were going to be better. It never made any sense because we couldn't trust them.
One of the issues was a big lack of transparency in this whole process, and I think everybody can agree that that was kind of done behind closed doors. Has any of that changed since then? It seems like there's a lot of secretive things still happen behind closed doors on Beacon Hill. Has that whole process changed?
I mean, I think it's better now. I mean, when I look back and I look what Chris has done with the No Olympics movement, I mean, to me, that marked an inflection point in city politics. I mean, it used to be a small group of powerful men could decide the future of Boston. And I think what Boston 2024 and the whole the No Olympic movement showed that can no longer be the case, that it has to be more democratic. The power needs to be shared. And I think that's been a good thing that's come out of Boston losing the Olympics. Like, we didn't squander that lesson. We learned from that. And I think from 2015 to now, I think you see power being shared in Boston. And I think that's better.
But is there still more that can be done, Chris?
Well, absolutely, there's more that needs to be done. We always want to be more transparent and more open. Let me just add to Shirley's comment, though. I think it's reflective that the very first elected official in the city of Boston who raised some tough questions about Boston 2024, who was willing to go up against the power structure and say, I'm not opposed, but I'm worried and I want these questions answered, was then City Councilor Mayor Michelle Wu. And that's reflective of the change that we've made as a city to have someone like her who was an outsider, came up as an outsider, not from Boston, but is now of Boston. She's embraced the city and the city has embraced her. That was in part because she was pushing for more transparency in that early conversation. And I do think it's been a change.
All right. So we call ourselves the hub of the universe, right? And I'm just wondering, is there ever an opportunity that we're going to be able to actually host an international event that makes us the true hub of the universe?
So we do that every single year. So every single year we have the Boston Marathon, just occurred a few weeks ago. What a wonderful moment for the city. But we do it on our terms, not on the terms of the IOC, which is an unelected body thousands of miles away. We do it every summer or every fall when we welcome people from around the world to come to our universities and colleges and make Boston their home. And we're going to do it in 2 years with the World Cup, which will be hosted here in Massachusetts. That's going to be an amazing event, but doesn't require the billions of dollars of construction that the Olympics would have cost.
So to me, the biggest takeaway about Boston 2024 is it raises the question, does Boston dare to do something bold? Think about the Big Dig was a big idea, a bold idea. It cost a lot of money, and it transformed the city. We depressed the Central Artery, brought us the Greenway, brought us the Seaport District. Is Boston, are we too cautious to do something big and bold again? Like, maybe it wasn't the Olympics, but what is that? What is something big and bold we're willing to embrace that will transform the city?
So can we?
I think we can, but we have to get past, saying no all the time, and we also have to learn to build consensus, because when we move to an era of shared power, it will be really hard to build consensus. It will take longer, but we have to find a way to get back to not be afraid to do something bold.
I always find Michelle Wu to be kind of between Menino and Walsh in many ways, where I'm sure Menino would say no.
Right.
Just no. And then Walsh would say, let's do it.
Yes,
Let's do it.
Like an eager puppy, right? Yes, let's do it.
Chris, how would you describe your relationship with folks who were leaders at that time in the city? I mean, you're still involved in politics. You've run for office. I imagine you're going to run again at some point, unless you want to make an announcement here.
I've got a 3-month-old at home and a very understanding wife, but not that understanding. So no big announcements other than I'm going to be a dad. Look, I think it was a really interesting experience to be on the outside and to be going up against these powerful folks. Our effort was outspent 1,500 to 1. They spent $15 million on the bid. We spent less than $10,000 on our side, but yet we had more individual contributors to our campaign, just a much lower average contribution size than the other side had. In many cases, I've tried to extend and reach out to some of those folks. I would highlight, for example, John Fish, who was an early leader of the bid, who I think was very gracious and thoughtful and called me after the bid was pulled, and he said, Chris, I think democracy worked. And that was a really, I think, smart and wise thing of him to say. And he's really, I think, moved on. Not everybody has moved on, but I credit the folks that have, and I've been partners with them on other projects.
Well, we thank you both for coming in and talking about this. We'll do it again in another 10 years, okay? Shirley and Chris Dempsey, thanks so much.
We can enjoy the Olympics from afar.
Yes, thanks for having us.
Folks, NBC 10 this summer.
Thank you guys for being